Good morning and welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. Today we're going to discuss an important area of bioethics. Specifically, we're going to be looking at global health ethics. Now, rationing touched upon global health ethics in that it asked us to engage with the question of what duties states have towards providing healthcare resources to their citizens. And in situations where you have a limited amount of resources, how best should these resources be rationed or distributed? Today, we're going to discuss rationing questions, etc., questions concerning how best to address pandemics that arise when we look at bioethics in a global context. So, we'll not only be looking at what duties do states have towards their citizens, but also we'll be questioning what duties individuals have to those who are living in other states and in other countries, etc. And here I use states as not as something to denote individual states in, say, the United States, but more generally as another country or another sovereign, quote unquote, state here, right? Another area around the world. So class today will be structured as follows. First, we'll be situating the conversation. What is global bioethics? How did global bioethics come about, especially when placed in a historical context? And we see how individual states tend to focus on the well-being of their citizens. Well, how did this conversation about what cosmopolitan duties we have sort of develop over the years? We'll be looking, in this vein, we'll be looking at the history of global health. Then we'll be discussing the creation of the WHO, World Health Organization, which oversees many of the international pushes towards addressing global health issues. And we'll be looking at the Millennium Development Goals, which came out of the WHO and works as sets of goals or standards that we're attempting to bring about. And we'll be looking at 3 more justice frameworks that not only engage with how best to distribute goods, etc., what is fair, but also who has a duty to help those outside of country boundaries. And then I'll be pointing you towards a case study. So that's a lot of material, a lot of stuff to talk about. So let's get started. And just to situate the conversation, throughout the semester, we've been exploring several of the subfields of bioethics. So initially, we discussed biomedical ethics, or the ethical analysis of practice in clinical medicine and medical research. So we've been looking at questions that typically arise in clinical settings when you are practicing medicine or engaged in some sort of healthcare-related activity. And then we discussed research ethics and the ethical questions that arise when we are engaging in both human research and non-human animal research. And now we'll be switching our focus or lens to global health ethics or justice, issues that arise outside of country origins, as this is a third major area in bioethics. So it's the analysis of ethical issues at the global level. And we will be looking at, say, should we outsource clinical trials, et cetera. That will play a prominent role in our discussion on Wednesday, for example. When we think of bioethics, should it be confined to clinical and research settings? Or should we expand bioethics to include other environmental factors, be that the development of certain infrastructure, pollution, etc., that could play a major role in influencing health outcomes? And that's very much a live question today, or diet as well, and food bioethics, etc. So we'll be finishing up our discussion by looking at this sort of emerging branch of biomedical ethics. Now that we've situated the conversation, let's set the stage. Global health. How did this come about? Well, Kaplan et al. Defined global health as, quote, And as good bioethicists, we're always focused on defining our terms as an area for study, research, and practice that places a priority on improving health and achieving health equity for all people worldwide, end quote. And I just want to note the reason why I quoted this is to highlight some of the assumptions that are built into global health as a definition, normative assumptions here, right? Study, research, and practice. But here's the normative component that places a priority on improving health and achieving health equity for all people worldwide. So already we have a definition of what is fair within we have a conception of what is fair within the definition of global health, achieving health equity. And we can discuss then, and we will be discussing, well, should we focus on that conception of fairness? And remember, we have three working definitions of what is fair. Is health equity what we want to hang our hat on, so to speak? And two, well, this is all fair and good, but this does again entail a duty to achieve health equity. Who has that duty? Is it acceptable to argue that developed nations, for example, have a duty to help achieve health equity outside of national boundaries? And that, again, is a very live question in the context of global health bioethics. And so I want to bring that up right at the beginning, just because I want to engage with those themes throughout this lecture. All right, so global health typically includes three components. First, as we'll see in the history of global health initiatives, there's a practical national security component, and that includes the control of infectious diseases. If we have infectious diseases, say, developing in another context, as we have seen relatively recently, it's very difficult to ensure that said infections, especially depending on how, say, viruses are transmitted, whether it's airborne, etc. But it tends to be very difficult to close down borders and to protect a population from infection. And so what you typically want to do, at least historically, is control infectious diseases where they first developed. And hence why we have medical professionals rushing to Ebola outbreaks to help address these diseases or mitigate these diseases before they become a huge issue. And so this is very much seen as part and parcel of national security. To protect the health of our citizens, we need to ensure that pandemics are cut off at the root. And this is also connected to assurances that, the population health will be protected within national contexts. Now, with the rise of international trade, as we'll see again when we look at the historical development of global health, this national security component of global health very much began to take center stage. As ships and later on airplanes move goods from context to context, and you have unanticipated stowaways, so to speak, that could be disastrous, that could play a disastrous role in negatively impacting population health. And we've seen this from Mycenaeans and the Greek city-states all the way up to the modern context. Then there's another component that very much connects to what's called development ethics, or this role of developed nations in helping to address negative health outcomes for individuals in contexts. And so there's this push to help improve individual health, especially in countries that have particularly abysmal individual health outcomes. And this is wrapped up with addressing poverty and ensuring that people have adequate access to housing, water, safe water, etc. Then we also have a group health component or a distributive justice component, where there are arguments that certain health inequalities, especially in areas that are trading partners with larger developed countries, or in areas that have a history of colonialism, that there is a sort of fairness component here, that health injustices need to be addressed because of the historical role that developed countries played in bringing about the negative health outcomes. So, very roughly, we see these three areas of concern playing out in global health. So we have this definition, but we also have a national security component, an individual health component connected to development programs that are enacted by, say, the WHO and the World Bank. And then we have this distributive justice component as well. So, how did global health bioethics come about? Well, we begin to see the development of um, conventions and contracts, if you will, between various nations as we see a rise in epidemics. So, for example, codes, treaties, and policies are typically developed at the national level, but then as national security concerns concerning epidemics sort of came to the forefront, we're seeing the development of treaties between various nationalities, between various nations, to help address these collective concerns. So between 1816 and 1819, for example, there are 6 cholera epidemics worldwide. And this directly led to the creation of the International Sanitary Convention between European countries, where they banded together, pulled their resources in order to mitigate the long term and short term, although they were quite devastating, but impacts of these epidemics. So, this was one of the first examples of an international code that was designed to contain epidemics at the global level. Then we fast forward into the 1900s. We're seeing yellow fever outbreaks, and this prompted the development of the Pan American Sanitary Bureau in 1924. So, whereas the International Sanitary Convention was between European countries, the Pan American Sanitary Bureau was typically between the United States and Central and South America in order to help get in front of epidemics very quickly within this context. And this prompted the creation of the Pan American Sanitary Code. And then in France and French-speaking countries, we see the development of the Office of the International Hygiene Publique in 1907. So as epidemics are developing, post the development of this international trade and the ever-increasing interconnectivity between nations, we're seeing the development of codes, treaties, and policies to help mitigate the negative public health impacts of epidemics. Now, it's very important here to not lessen the impact of private organizations. Yes, public health programs are very much in the purview of nations in the form of these treaties and conventions that we're talking about. However, private organizations since the beginning have also contributed and have played a major role in addressing global health injustices or disparities, so to speak. And this is typically in the form of non-governmental organizations. We'll be talking about NGOs on Wednesday, especially for those of you who are interested in doing work in Doctors Without Borders. In fact, we had a previous student at BUSU who did a tour in Doctors Without Borders before going on to medical school. Just as a plug, very proud of him. He did excellent work, and it looked great on his application too. But that aside, these non-governmental organizations do play an important role. Just to give you an example, the Rockefeller Foundation, their Board of Health, which was developed in 1913, so it's been around for quite a few years, is the single largest funder of global health worldwide. So it's very much important not to, well, the single largest funder of global health worldwide prior to World War II, as we will see. So it's important not to forget or to downplay the role of these non-governmental organizations. Now, fast forward, we have the development of these codes and treatises. We have the Rockefeller Foundation making a splash in global health. World War II comes about. All international health efforts were interrupted due to this conflict. And so global health initiatives screeched to a halt during this time period. However, post-World War II, we see global health treaties coming back to the forefront, global health concerns coming back to the forefront, as was intimated in some of the previous discussions that we had. So in 1946, we have the development of the United Nations. So the United Nations then approved the creation of the World Health Organization. So we have the development of the United Nations post-World War II, and then right away we have WHO coming to the forefront as one of the leaders in global health initiatives internationally. So the WHO Constitution was originally signed by over 61 countries, so we see a lot of buy-in. So rather than those smaller treaties that we see between, say, the European Union or between the United States and Central and South America, now we're seeing these codified or are being consolidated into this larger organization, WHO. So I have a brief video just putting this into context. Here we go.
The struggle against epidemics is a global one, for the danger of death is worldwide. Then, what is the answer? Within the framework of the United Nations, a new organization exists to promote the welfare of all people, the World Health Organization. In its first assembly, July 1948, Director General Dr. Chisholm declared that this organization was physically prepared to raise the health level of all people and to forever destroy the human afflictions of malaria, cholera, tuberculosis, and syphilis. The prime objective of the World Health Organization is the fight against disease on a global scale. The representatives of nearly every nation have signed the Great Charter of Health. This means an organization with the authority and means to act. Epidemics, no matter what part of the world they may infect, are a potential danger to all other nations. The World Health Organization will make full use of every existing means: education, prevention, cure. All peoples of every race and belief will be helped by doctors from all races and nations. A tremendous movement of world solidarity is now born.
Yeah, so just to highlight, that's one of the initial sort of advertisements, if you will, for the World Health Organization. And it very much echoes this commitment towards addressing epidemics and eradicating disease where diseases first develop in order to protect the health, the public health of all citizens worldwide. So we sort of see a cosmopolitan aspect in this as well. It is our responsibility to take on this, like this fight against disease and bring it to the global level and not simply the national level. So it's this push to expand the duty to expand our duty to address health inequalities. So again, the WHO Constitution, originally signed by over 61 countries, now we have over 200 countries signed on to WHO, so it is a huge leader in public health today. Now, the World Health Organization initial duties included the following, and it's important to recognize these. It set international health standards. Currently, previously there were no international health standards, or the health standards were limited to the contexts within which the treaties were held. It also sanctioned working with governments to develop public health programs if public health programs are not developed or have not been developed in certain contexts. It was the beginning of data collection efforts so that we can utilize said information to get ahead of health issues. It also includes robust epidemic surveillance to help ensure, again, that national security component to help ensure that we can get in front of epidemic because of the widespread negative impacts of epidemics to not only the health of populations, but also the wider economic and security issues associated with epidemics. And it included research, training, and emergency relief as well. And emergency relief here, because healthcare is seen holistically by the WHO, this includes famine relief or natural disasters such as hurricanes, volcanoes erupting, tornadoes, etc. So following World War II and the collapse of colonial systems, this program took on new urgency because many countries were impoverished and many countries were, especially in developing nations, quote unquote, I'm scared quoting that, were left without healthcare infrastructures or robust healthcare infrastructures. And so this was seen as highly problematic from a health context. So we have global health programs adopting not only epidemic surveillance and data collection initiatives, but also this push to help improve the infrastructure of developing countries in order to help address health inequalities. Right? So international development then became a component of this sort of push for global health. Now, how does WHO define health? What is health here? And I sort of intimated that they take on a holistic perspective, hence why they're pushed to emergency relief and to wider development goals. Well, WHO defines health as, quote, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, end quote. So as you can see, the World Health Organization here, WHO, they have a robust definition of what health is, right? Not merely the absence of disease or of infirmity, right? And so if you do accept this definition of health, then it necessarily entails that development programs meant to improve infrastructure, economic well-being, etc., become part and parcel of health care, at least in a global context. And that's another question that we could raise, right? And this is another live question in global bioethics. Is this an acceptable definition of health? Is this definition of health too broad? Right? What issues should be placed under the umbrella of healthcare? And what issues should not be placed under the umbrella of healthcare. So we have certain bioethicists who argue that, bioethics and, health in general should largely focus on clinical matters. The absence of disease or infirmity, that should be what healthcare focuses on. Whereas we have a whole nother contingent in medical contexts that argue, well, because these environmental factors influence health, they need to be placed under the umbrella of healthcare. It's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So social issues need to be addressed. Systems of oppression need to be placed under there. Robust mental health facilities and services need to be placed under healthcare, in addition to any sort of impacts that negatively impact physical well-being. All of this needs to be under health. So this is one question that you could engage with in your discussion for the week. Is this acceptable? Or should we accept a limited definition of health? Or should we accept this expanded definition of health? So social factors here, social well-being, include adequate income, and as we'll see in the development goals, adequate access to nutrition, and access to other social goods or bundles of social goods that, as Amartya Sen would argue, that ensure that your needs are met. So I have another video. talking about the various factors.
The world is rapidly changing. It is home to 800 million more people than a decade ago. More people live in cities and travel than ever before. With many new partners working on global health, political leaders are realizing that health is essential for people and countries to reach their full potential. And that's why the World Health Organization works to make sure that everyone, wherever they live, has access to medicines and essential health services when they need them. Based on research, WHO sets standards and makes recommendations that protect people as they grow, live, work, and age. It's all linked. Enable children to survive and reach their full potential. Ensure their mothers have healthy pregnancies and can continue to contribute to society. To ensure people enjoy longer, healthier, and more productive lives, we find new and better approaches and then work hard to put innovation into action. We've seen results. HIV mortality has been cut in half from 2005 to 2015. Measles vaccines have prevented more than 20 million child deaths since 2000. WHO is assisting more countries to move towards providing universal health coverage so that everyone has access to affordable health services. But there's still a lot of work to be done, whether it's rapid response to an epidemic or cultivating local partnerships with people on the ground. WHO is a driving force for a healthier world, boosting the trajectory of lives saved and laying the foundation for better health for all. Solutions for a healthy world, for everyone, everywhere. WHO stands as the guardian of health.
So the reason why I show you that video is because it illustrates how WHO is working towards addressing negative health concerns or health concerns globally, but also how it's actualizing this expanded definition of what health is and how that very much is a driving force towards the initiatives that WHO take up. So in 2000, WHO released the Millennium Development Goals, which is girded by or built on this expanded definition of health to set the agenda for global health into the 21st century. And we've since revisited Millennium Development Goals to see how the benchmarks, how far along we are getting to said benchmarks. So these 8 benchmarks are seen as imperative for addressing health inequalities or inequities. There's this push to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger because poverty and hunger negatively impact the health of large groups of people worldwide. This push to provide universal primary education, as education is seen as a contributor to lessening certain health inequities, to improve gender equity and empowerment of women, to reduce childhood mortality, to improve maternal health, to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, to promote environmental sustainability, to develop global partnerships for economic development. So the reason why I have 4, 5, and 6 here is because 4, 5, and 6 are very much focused on health-related concerns, whereas 1, 2, 3, 7, and 8 here are very much girded in this expanded definition of health to address various socioeconomic health impacts. And so you can see how we sort of have this sandwiching of specific clinical issues with the larger societal issues. So as we're seeing here with the Millennium Development Goals, WHO is primarily concerned with addressing both health inequalities experienced at the individual level and health inequalities at the social. So we have a balancing act here. How do we ensure the health of individuals? And remember our tripartite thing, national security falls under global health, ensuring adequate health of individuals and ensuring the adequate health of populations. And so the Millennium Development Goals very much highlight this commitment to all 3 areas in global health, individuals, social, and ensuring national security concerns by mitigating epidemics. All right. So again, we can discuss whether or not you agree. Is this an adequate set of goals? Do you think that any additional goals should be included? Do you think that some should be removed that should not be seen as under the umbrella of health? So again, that's a question or discussions that you could have in the discussion forum. So what are health inequalities as defined by the WHO? Well, health inequalities for WHO include the following. It's the uneven distribution of health resources in populations. So older patients may require more healthcare resources than younger. Women may have different needs due to pregnancy, etc. So rather than thinking of health, so we can think of it as health inequities here, actually, rather than health inequalities. So they're not saying that healthcare should be and healthcare resources should be evenly distributed across populations where everyone gets the same bundle of goods. What they're saying here is that health resources should be distributed based upon need, and that those who need particular resources to ensure their individual health should be given said resources. In the case of the elderly, they would receive a different bundle of resources based upon their unique needs. Women, especially during childbearing years, etc., would also receive a particular bundle based upon their needs. So we can very much think of it as equities. Now, health inequities here, bringing this into conversation, is the presence of systematic disparities in health between social groups. And so what we're looking at is not only how do we ensure the distribution of goods based upon need, so need-based conception of fairness play out here, but also how are health disparities being distributed across populations. And this is where justice frameworks come in, right? Are the benefits and harms of healthcare systems in certain contexts placing inordinate risk on one group while other groups are receiving more of the benefits? And how do we ensure that all social groups within contexts are receiving the healthcare bundles of resources, from services to ventilators? How do we ensure that all groups receive equal access here, right? So WHO has a robust conception of health inequities that include individuals and include social components of health. Now, we've been discussing justice concerns, especially when we've been discussing the principle of justice and principalism, but also concerns over rationing. And remember, we looked at 3 definitions of fairness and how this will very much impact whether or not you think a healthcare policy is just. We looked at justice as equality, need-based justice, and merit-based. And we see need-based justice frameworks coming to the forefront here, and equity-focused justice frameworks as well. However, this begs the question, right? We've been discussing how best to distribute goods. And yes, different definitions of fairness and distributive justice frameworks help us with these questions. But they tell us nothing about whether or not we actually have a duty to help. Prior to the development of the international treaties in the 1800s and 1900s, for example, public health concerns were largely limited to national boundaries. So the WHO literature, this push since World War II to eradicate disease worldwide, begs the question, or asks us to engage with the following question: do wealthy countries have a duty to rectify the inequitable distribution of diseases and healthcare resources throughout the world? Do we have a duty to our citizens in national contexts? And do we have a duty to those populations who are not in our national context? And if so, What are those duties? So our distributive justice frameworks, they're limited in that, yes, they tell us how to distribute justly, but not who has a duty to help. And as we'll see on Wednesday and on Friday, there's very much an engaging discussion concerning whether or not we have a duty to help, with Peter Singer arguing that yes, we do, and several bioethicists arguing that no, we don't. So again, like once we look at these arguments, I'm curious where you think we stand. So we need justice frameworks then, if we're going to be talking about global health ethics, to help us determine not only what is just distribution, but also who has a duty to address such injustices. So let's look at 3 general justice frameworks that engage with this question. We'll be looking at social contract theory very quickly, nationalism, and cosmopolitanism. Let's see. I just looked at the time and there's so much material to cover today. I was like, we're almost at 40 minutes. We haven't even gotten into the justice frameworks yet. But I hope you guys are enjoying this sort of brief historical purview of global health. I think it's a fascinating topic. So let's look at nationalism. From a nationalist perspective, the just distribution of health and healthcare is a matter for nations. We need to focus on providing enough resources to ensure that our citizens' health, their needs are addressed. And it's not a global concern, in that, especially if we have limited resources now. If we already, say, for example, have limited ventilators, just to continue using that as an example, we're not going to be sending our limited supply out of our national boundaries. We're going to be utilizing the limited resources that we currently have in order to ensure the health of our current population, the health of citizens. And in this view, public health standards are set by each nation, and each nation has a particular responsibility to their individual citizens that does not necessarily go beyond national boundaries. So each nation has a duty to ensure the fair distribution of health and healthcare for their own people. And everything beyond that is gravy, right? So there are a common set of concerns that push back against the nationalist perspective. And that's, well, what is a nation and what's a national identity, right? Does this mean that we provide healthcare to citizens only? Or does this mean that we provide healthcare to everyone within a particular spatial area? Like if you live within, say, the context of the United States, do you obtain access to healthcare? Well, what about military personnel and those who are citizens, but not in the spatial context? So what are we talking about, right? What is a nation? What is national identity? What is it to belong to a nation? What is the nature of the pro-national attitude? And also, is membership in a nation voluntary or involuntary? Do we just assume that everyone is a part of the nation if you're born as a member of said nation? Or do you need to state that you are a member of said nation, right? So there are questions concerning where duties should lie, right? Who has a right to healthcare resources when we're taking a nationalist perspective. And then we have normative concerns as well. So those are descriptive concerns. Is the attitude of caring about national identity always appropriate? And Peter Singer would argue that it's not, although other bioethicists will argue that it is quite appropriate. And how much then as well should one care? If there are huge health disparities outside of national context, well, how much aid are we talking about here? Are we talking about token relief? Or are we talking about contributing a sizable chunk of our GDP? What does it mean to address negative health outcomes outside of national boundaries, especially when we're looking at when such health disparities can be quite severe and could be quite expensive to address. And so this broadens our discussion then of what rationing should look like and who should be included in rationing calculations. And there's social contract theory. And we touched upon social contract theory at the beginning of the bioethics. And we've been discussing social contracts from the ancient Greeks, from Crito to Hobbes, where he argues that life is brutish and short until you have the development of the Leviathan, which is the state, and that we give up certain freedoms in order to obtain certain protections under the state. So we can't go and steal, well, in the case of Hobbes, we can't go and steal another person's horse, or kill them, commit murder within a state. There are certain rules that limit our freedoms. But, and on the other side of the coin, while we cannot do that, we can live in relative peace and be rest assured that other people will not be stealing our horse, or other people will not be attempting to take our lives or whatnot. So there are certain duties and rights that are associated with living within a national context. And that's seen as signing the social contract. And Rawls very much expands this social contract theory to wed it to sort of this egalitarian conception of justice. So if we take a social justice or a social contract theory framework, then nations, yes, determine global standards of justice by consensus through international treaties or declarations. So it includes this nationalist component in that you have certain rights and duties associated with citizenship or with being a part of a nation. However, as nations are sovereign powers, they can also determine whether or not they want to create contracts with other nations, right? So nations have a duty not only to uphold the obligations that they have to individual citizens and ensure public health, etc., but they also, in the expansion of said contracts, have a duty to uphold the obligations that they agree to in international contracts. So if we sign on to the WHO, for example, or if we sign on to various international contracts, agreements, etc., that entail certain rights but also include certain duties, then we have an obligation to follow through. So in this context, what is our duty to populations outside of national boundaries? Well, a social contract theorist would argue depends on the contract. Nations only have a duty to provide aid if they entered into a contract that stipulated that aid would be given. So whereas a nationalist framework would be like, we don't have any duties to those outside of national boundaries, a social contract theorist would argue we could have duties outside of national boundaries, but that really depends on what treaties we've signed, and so forth and so on. And then we have the rise of cosmopolitanism. And cosmopolitanism, as the name denotes, forces us to engage with a more expansive conception of what is a citizen. And it's this view that we are all citizens of the world, and as such, we have duties to others no matter the distance. So the core shared by all cosmopolitan views is the idea that all human beings, regardless of political affiliation, nationality, etc., are citizens of a single global community. And as such, we have duties to citizens, to these global citizens, to help address any negative outcomes that could be impacting their lives. So, and this comes from the view that standards of justice, if they are universal, they should apply across national boundaries. As we'll see in the Singer piece, he argues that if we recognize that we need to help those in need, in the case of, say, we're walking down the street and there's a kid that's drowning, you would jump in and typically save that child, even if you don't know said child, because it's the right thing to do. And Singer expands that. Well, should distance play a role here? If the drowning child is right next to you versus the drowning child is 5,000 miles away, it seems like if that duty is universal, then you have a duty to both children. And as such, this sort of undergirds this cosmopolitan view. So if you accept cosmopolitanism, then all nations, and even individuals within nations, they have a duty to ensure just distribution of health and healthcare throughout the world. And we see this echoing in WHO's advertisements, et cetera, that I showed you earlier. And the reason why I showed you that is to highlight the particular type of justice framework that is sort of undergirding and forming the impetus for WHO and for other global health initiatives. However, I do want to highlight that we are having this robust conversation. Should we take on a nationalist perspective, a justice framework? Should we take on a social contract framework or a cosmopolitan framework? Because this is very much an unsettled question, right? And that impacts our answer to who has a duty to help. Okay, so I'd like you to consider these two questions as we close our discussion for today. We have these three frameworks. We looked at the history and development of global health worldwide from the 1800s up to current WHO applications and the development of the Global Development Goals. We've seen how health, the definition of health, has expanded from in the 18 and 1900s. Let us mitigate the impacts of epidemics to let us embrace development programs to help address social factors that influence health. And we've seen we've explored three justice frameworks that answer the question of who has a duty to help quite differently: nationalism, social contract theory, and cosmopolitanism. So I'd like you to consider the arguments for and against a moral obligation to foreign aid. Which arguments do you find most persuasive or unpersuasive, and why? And the money question here: do you think nations should be held responsible for correcting the imbalance of health outcomes? Or should each nation try to act in their own best interest? And this is a particularly live question, as globally, different nations are jockeying for access to healthcare resources, as healthcare systems are being taxed in many different countries. Taxed in that they're being overloaded, not taxed in the fiscal sense here. So they're being, strained, so to speak. Right? So what do you think? And I will leave you with these questions today. Now, I hope you have a great day, and I am looking forward to the conversation ahead. Thank you. Take care.